Thank you, thank you. Flip and I did a little thing for the Jersey Jazz Society out at Shanghai Jazz a little while back. And we got along so well together that we decided we should do some more of these things. So this is concert number 2. The whole idea of this kind of lecture demonstration is to give you a feeling of what it's like to be a jazz musician, how you get to be one. New York is the place that most of them come because this is where the music is, which is what the drummer that brought me to New York told me. If you want to be a jazz musician, you got to go where it is. So we got on the bus and came out here. Well, I grew up, I was born actually in a tiny town on the railroad. Its only reason is it is a town to start with was that it had a roundhouse for the Great Northern Railroad, I believe it was, and a town named Othello, Washington. My grandparents lived there, and even though my parents lived in Kirkland, Washington, which is much closer to Seattle, my mother went over to Othello to have me, and so that's always been my birthplace, and it's the name of my publishing company, Othello Music. My mother was a very good musician. She sang soprano, she played the piano, she could read, she couldn't fake. I asked her one time when her eyes started to get bad, she said, "I can't see the music anymore." And I said, "Well, you should have learned to fake a long time ago." And she said, "Well, I wasn't given that gift." So, but she was a very good musician, and she filled our house with music. She had a lot of vocal students. And when I was still a kid taking naps in my crib, she would sing a phrase, da 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 da, and her student would sing, da 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 da, and then from my crib I would sing, da 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 da. So I was a part of most of her music lessons. But after we got, we had an Edison cylinder phonograph with about 12 cylinders, I believe. Most of them were from vaudeville, the Three Black Crows, and there was a song called "With His Hands in His Pockets and His Pockets in His Pants, He Gets a Little Wiser Every Day," which I still remember all the words to. And but when I was about 5, we got our first table radio, and I was glued to that radio until I went to school. But it was like a year and a half there, something like that, and I learned hundreds of songs, which I still remember. A lot of them nobody sings anymore. They were being sung by people like Gladys Swarthout, and who was there? There was a tenor that was very popular in those days, whose name I forget at the moment. But and then we listened to the National Barn Dance. There were all of those country songs and all those comic songs. And I may be one of the few people that still remembers a lot of those tunes. But in there somewhere was also Cole Porter and Irving Berlin and all of that wonderful American songbook that I still trade on. We love those songs and we still play them. So it wasn't until I got into grade school. My mother tried to teach me piano when I was 4 or 5, and I ran into a wall, couldn't get past the first elementary book. But in the 4th grade, we got a good music teacher in our school system who started me out on the trumpet. When I said I wanted to play the trumpet, my dad sent away to Sears Roebuck for $9.95, got me a brass trumpet. And I tried to play that for a couple of years, and then I complained to the teacher that I couldn't seem to get enough chops to play the first part. I wanted to play the melody. And he said, "Well, you're probably never going to really have a good trumpet embouchure, but the school owns this baritone horn, which nobody's playing, and it's a beautiful instrument. Why don't you try it?" Well, I took it home and fell in love with it, and by the time I graduated from high school, I had a horn of my own, and I was going to solo contests and winning them, getting high marks, you know, that kind of thing. I was really a good baritone horn player. And I took that into the Army, and met this cornet player from Brookline, Massachusetts, who was a moldy fig. He knew everything from Louis Armstrong to Bobby Hackett, and he taught me that whole repertoire. I'm playing Dixieland baritone horn. And he finally said to me, by the time we were stationed in Fort Meade, Maryland, near Baltimore, he said, why don't you get a valve trombone? That's really more of a jazz instrument. And Juan T. Zoll and Brad Gowans play that instrument. It's legitimate, you know. So we went into Baltimore and I found this old Kahn valve trombone. And that became my instrument. When I came back to Seattle out of the Army, I was a bebop valve trombone player. And when my friend talked me into coming to New York, that's what I came as. I'm playing the valve trombone. Well, he got a job up in the Adirondacks that originally was Gene Rowland's job, but Gene had a big fight with the boss's wife the first night and walked out. And my friend salvaged the job and put his two friends up there. He had John Benson Brooks on piano, a famous songwriter, and Freddie Greenwell, who was the best tenor player in Seattle, and a trumpet player named Marty Bell, who my friend Buzzy thought sounded a lot like Buck Clayton, so he hired him. And they had a quartet, but no bass player. So he invited me to come up, but it was way up, 400 miles north. I hitchhiked up there and took my trombone along, thought I was just going to have a weekend in the mountains on my friend. And he talked the boss into hiring me. He said, hey, the extra horn sounds great, doesn't it? He says, yeah. He said, well, my friend's got a little spot on his lung, so he's got to stay in the mountains for a while. He's very much in demand in New York, And so the boss says, well, offer him $15 a week and room and board. Wow, manna from heaven. I had no other prospects at all, so I stayed there for that whole summer. And maybe the second week I was on the job, I come down to work, and there's a bass on the bandstand. And I said, hey, the boss finally broke down and hired a bass player? He says, no, I rented this from a kid that owns it. He said, I gave him $20 for the summer, and you got to try to play this whenever you're not playing the trombone. He said, I can't stand playing without a bass player. So all the guys on the bandstand could tell me what they wanted to hear, but nobody could tell me how to play this thing. I had to figure it out myself. I did know what the tuning was. I had somehow learned that in the past. And so by the end of the summer, I had found the notes on this thing enough that when I came back to New York, I could offer myself as a bass player. But I didn't have a bass. So if I would pick up a Saturday night at Charlie's Tavern, I would run over to 6th Avenue and rent a bass from Noah Wolf for $5 for the weekend. And then I'd go down to Jack Silver's and rent a tux for $5 for the weekend. And the job would probably pay 15 or 20. But in those days, you could live on $5. There were very cheap places to buy food. And I had a furnished room that was a block from Birdland that only cost me $8 a week. And then I met a drummer in Birdland that said, oh, I've got a place that costs $12. Why don't you split it with me? So that cut me down to $6. It was great, So, but Birdland was the place where we all learned from Charlie Parker. It was great. Well, I want to go back a little bit because that teacher that got me to play the baritone in high school was the guy that really turned me on to jazz. He called me into his house one day as I was walking home from school and said, I want you to hear something. I go into his house. In the first place, he had a record player that played flat records. I thought that was really hip, 2 tunes on each record. And he put on this record of Louis Armstrong playing West End blues. As an aspiring trumpet player, that was something that just really touched me to the core. I still love to hear that record. It's just so beautiful. And it made a jazz player out of me right away. I wanted to do that, So I started going. There was a little electric store in Kirkland called McDougal Electric that had refrigerators and washing machines, and over in the corner, a bunch of 78 records. And they even had a little player you could listen to see if you wanted to buy it, In those days, it was all right to sample the records. So I would go in there and listen to all these records, and I started buying Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington and especially Nat Cole. I thought Nat Cole was the most wonderful thing. In those days, he wasn't mainly a singer. He was a great piano player who occasionally sang a song. You know? And when he decided to have a singing career, all the jazz players were devastated because they had all been learning from his piano playing, and he wasn't recording as a pianist anymore. But one of the first records, and of course his big hit, was Sweet Lorraine.